Questions?
Good morning. Thank you for being here. I look forward to spending my time with you this morning, studying the Word of God. Welcome to our guests. We appreciate you being with us today. And looking forward to opening up our Bibles. We're going to be here in Matthew chapter 20. Thanks to Joel for reading that. Thanks to Drew for leading us in the song service, and Rich for your thoughts around the table this morning. Brother Bob Hoops for leading us in the prayer. Just a wonderful opportunity to worship and praise God and reverence Him this morning. And I'm glad you're here. What about tomorrow? You know, it's been our intention to make this year's theme as practical as possible, to try to provide you with tools that you can use to measure your spiritual progress and to grow in your relationship with God. I think sometimes when it comes to spiritual things, and maybe some of us with life in general,
we spend a lot of life in a react mode where life simply happens and we move from one crisis to the next, and we don't have a lot of forethought or planning or personal growth for what's needed. So when the crisis comes, we wind up going in a position of weakness rather than a position of strength. And we can be caught flat-footed as we go through life. And sometimes when it comes to spiritual things when this happens, some people's faith gets rocked to the core. And we need to understand that life is going to happen for all of us. And so when position of strength rather than weakness, to go into the storm prepared. And that is why building a spiritual plan is something that is so essential to leading a successful spiritual life. And so that is why, essentially, why we are focusing this year on what about tomorrow. I want to take you to two passages this morning before we begin. And we're going to be back in Matthew 20 in just a few minutes, but Mark, well, first I want to take you to Mark 10. Then we're going to go back to Matthew 20. For some reason, this has plagued me throughout my entire career of preaching. I always get Matthew and Mark mixed up for some reason. So first, I want to take you to Mark chapter 10. And I want you to look here at this story. So verse 35, James and John come to Jesus, and they ask him a question. Notice what they ask. Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you. Now that, first of all, that's a bold question. Coming to Jesus, Jesus, we want you to do whatever we ask. And so Jesus responds in the next verse and says, what do you want me to do for you? And so then, if you think their question in verse 35 is bold, look at what they ask in verse 37. Grant us to sit one at your right hand and one at your left in your glory. So in this passage, Mark chapter 10, what I really want you to focus on is this question that Jesus asked them in verse 36. What do you want me to do for you? Now, if you will, I want to take you back to the Matthew account, Matthew chapter 20, and we're going to go back to verse 29. Matthew chapter 20, verse 29. Here is Jesus and the disciples. They are getting ready to leave Jericho. There's a lot of people out there by the roadside. This is the normal case, by the way. Crowds are following. There are people that are paralyzed, laying on the ground, asking for money. These two understand that Jesus has come. They understand who Jesus is, and they cry out, Lord, have mercy on us, Son of David. And those in the crowd rebuke them, and they say, well, be quiet. It didn't stop these men, though. They cry out all the louder, Lord, have mercy on us, Son of David. And then I want you to see the next verse. Here's Jesus. He stops, and he looks at them, and he says, what do you want me to do for you? Now that's interesting. Here we have two separate occasions in the New Testament that I could find where the same exact question is asked of Jesus. What is it that makes this so interesting? Because when you think about it, Jesus already knew what they were going to ask. He already knew what they wanted. And in this case here, he could have healed these two individuals without saying a word, but he didn't. He wants them to declare what they want. And so it could be argued that their greatest need was for clarity because they needed to understand what they wanted, and he wanted them to be able to verbalize their desire. And so if you go on to verse 33 here in the text, they do just that. Lord, let our eyes be opened. If you're reading out of the Holman Christian Standard, it says, Lord, I want to see. And it doesn't get more plain than that. But think about it. Specificity, verbalization, intentionality. Brothers and sisters, as we think about our spiritual lives, we need to understand that great results don't just happen. Usually you don't drift into a destination that you choose. Instead, you have to be intentional. You have to decide that's where you want to go. You get clear on what you want. You understand why it is important. And then you pursue a plan of action that will lead you down that path to accomplish your objective. During the month of February, we are talking about building your spiritual life plan. And over the last few weeks, we've gone through a series of lessons that start from the beginning where we give consideration to eliminating limiting beliefs and habits. We talked 2 weeks ago about what you think is important. From Proverbs chapter 4 and verse 23, guard your heart above all else, for it is the source of life. Proverbs 23:7 says, for as one reckons in his soul, so is he. So what we think matters. And sometimes we give into negative self-talk and hold ourselves back from accomplishing what we're actually able to do. Last week we talked about completing your past. And we talked about even after the wins and losses of life, we have to complete an after-action report to see why we won or why we lost. Last week we talked about how opportunity can come out of regret. And we also talked about the advantage of gratitude through writing down what we're thankful for, keeping a gratitude journal, and by beginning and ending every day in prayer, thanking God for what He's done for us. This morning, we want to get down to the nitty-gritty. We want to talk about how to achieve your spiritual goals. So 4 things we're going to do today as we study together. We're going to talk about why writing down your goals is an absolute essential. Then we're going to talk about 7 characteristics of effective goal setting. And we're going to learn the difference between an achievement goal and a habit goal. And then we're going to wrap up the lesson by really talking about how God's Word calls upon us to stretch ourselves when it comes to our spiritual growth, because that is how we move forward in faith. So there's an outline on the back side of your bulletin. Use that this morning as we go through and spend the next few moments reading and studying from God's Word. Why is it so important that we write down our goals? I want to just quiz you for a second. You don't have to answer. But when it comes to your spiritual life, when is the last time you've actually broken out a pen and paper? And I know that's old technology. We're all into iPads and typing and digital stuff these days. But when is the last time you have sat down with a pen and paper and literally wrote out some goals that you have for your spiritual life? For some of us, it may have been quite some time. But I want you to understand that there is power when we actually write these things down. Writing down our goals helps us to achieve them. And there's 5 reasons why this is the case. So when we write down our goals, one of the things it does is it forces us to clarify what we want. Just like Jesus did with those men on the road. When they come up, Lord, save us, help us. Jesus says, what is it that you want me to do? He forces them to verbalize what they wanted. When we write things down, it clarifies what exactly we want. It's been said that when we look at this, clarity is the word. Think about it in this regard. Now, some of you may have done this. But just to say, I want to go on a trip. Well, where are you going? Well, I don't know. I don't know where I'm going, but I'm going to start out on this trip. Well, then how do you pack? How do you know what roads that you're going to take? And most importantly, how do you know that you've arrived when you've gotten to your destination if you don't specify what the destination is? Now, sometimes we just all go through life and do the same thing. We wander around aimlessly. We have no forethought. We have no planning. We don't even know that we've arrived when we have arrived because we didn't set a destination to begin with. We weren't clear before we set out. Sometimes that happens quite often in the lives of New Testament Christians who drift around with little or no direction, and eventually they feel frustration. And in some of the worst cases, they give up in frustration because they don't get anything out of Christianity. Have you ever heard anyone say that before? It may be because they lack clarity. So, writing down our goals helps us clarify what we want. It also helps us to overcome resistance. Every meaningful intention, every dream encounters resistance. And so writing things down gives us an emotional and an intellectual attachment, and it helps us to forge resolve within ourselves. Writing down our goals also prompts us to action. It helps us when we review these things regularly, and it makes us carry through on what we talked about a few moments ago. Articulating these things is important, but we have to execute. We have to follow through. You know, and as you do this and you begin to move forward on your spiritual plan, there's going to be all sorts of opportunities and new things that come at you. And so writing down our goals helps filter opportunities. You know, think about it in this regard. Remember Matthew chapter 25 with the story of the 5-talent man and the 2-talent man. Remember that? They took those talents they'd been given. The 5-talent man goes out and he gains 5 more. The 2-talent man goes out and gains 2 more. You know, I wonder if in that process that there were other things that came up to these men as they used what they'd been given, but they understood that maybe these things in the long term would be distractions and keep them away from the goals they had set. Sometimes that happens with us. Sometimes new opportunities can serve as distractions from our overall goals and mission. And so writing things down help us to see if these goals and things align with our mission. And finally, writing down our goals helps us to see progress. If you can't see any progress, it is extremely difficult to continue. Think of the mile markers on the interstate when you're making a long trip. Sometimes those are a blessing, sometimes they're a curse. Sometimes when you just get started on the interstate, you're thinking, oh man, I've got 353 miles to go. I don't know how I'm going to do it. And finally you go 150 miles, go, all right, I can do this. I've only got 150 to go. So writing these things down helps us to see the progress. It tells us how far we've come. It tells us how far we need to go. So I want you to see the importance of this, brothers and sisters. All right, this is not anything just to walk out of here and say, well, that was a good idea, but you know, I've got a better way. This works, and we need to trust ourselves on this. So what about this process of setting some spiritual goals? How do you do that? What does goal setting look like? Well, for decades, business and professionals out in the world have used a 5-step system that's identified by the acronym SMART. The GE Corporation pioneered this back in the 80s, and in 2015, when I was at Wright State, I took a class that had a section on using this goal-setting method. Well, in his book, Michael Hyatt has added a couple of things on this, and he basically added 2 more steps and calls it the SMARTER system. Well, what is that? Well, let's talk about it for a few moments. When we start talking about, and this is basically an acronym that helps us to remember things we need to include as we set our spiritual goals. One is that we need to make our goals specific. We need to focus in. Focus is power. Listen, vague goals are uninspiring. Michael Hyatt in his writing has said the tougher and more specific goal is likely to make us more creative, engage our intellect, and move with persistence. So it is important for us to identify what we want to accomplish. So let me give you an example of what I would call a very vague and uninspiring goal. You sit down at the beginning of the year or the beginning of the month, or you sit down later today and you say, you know, I want to read a book of the Bible. Wow. That's inspiring. Oh, okay, I want to read a book of the Bible. Okay, well then, what is the specific book? Well, to be more specific, you could say this: I want to read the book of Nehemiah. All right, so we've narrowed it down. Instead of 1 out of 66, or instead of just some random book out of 66 books, we've narrowed it down to 1. So I'm going to read the book of Nehemiah. Okay, think about it in this regard. Here's another example. Well, I want to improve my marriage. Now that sounds good, right? Okay, I don't think all of us that are married would say that. I want to improve my marriage. Well, let's get a little more specific. How am I going to improve my marriage? Well, I could say, well, I'm going to designate one night every week for my wife. And so we've got to be specific in our goals. Here's something else we could do. We need to be sure that we make our goals measurable. How are you going to reach your goal? It's not helpful to go out and say, well, I'm going to make more money, or I'm going to exercise more, or I'm going to study the Bible more. We need to establish how much more. And so saying that you want to study your Bible doesn't do too much because it's not objective. Saying you want to do the daily Bible reading, however, every morning and meditate on the Proverbs and the words of wisdom at the end of every day's reading, that's something entirely different. Because it's more specific and it's measurable. You see, when the goal is measurable, you understand the criteria for success. You know how to measure yourself against the goal and chart your progress. Tim Cycle has said, half the fun of goals is the progress we make. We experience the strongest possible emotional response when we make progress on our most difficult goals. So we need to make sure that we make them measurable. We also need to make our goals actionable. We need to be clear on what we're going to do. So when I sit down to make my goals, I should use the words like read, or finish, eliminate, increase, or decrease. For example, a person may say, well, I want to become more consistent in reading my Bible class lesson. Well, that's a good idea. Good idea. I want to be more consistent in that. But what about if I got something where it's more actionable? What if I changed this and said, well, I want to read 2 Bible class lessons every week because I go to 2 Bible class lessons every week. So I want to be sure that I make it actionable, okay? Think about another example that we could use with this. I could decide that I want to be more aware of our widows and our widowers, and I want to serve them. Again, great goal, great idea, but how do I make this actionable? I come back and I say, well, I'm going to visit one of our widows every month, okay? And just think for a second. What if, 146-member congregation, what if every one of our members set some goals up like that? I am going to go visit one widow every month, or I'm going to go visit some of our older couples once a month, or I'm going to go visit some of our younger families and see how I can serve them. Think about how this congregation could be transformed to even a higher level because we've made our spiritual goals actionable. And as we do that, and we're all working together, guess what happens? There's an excitement and an atmosphere in the congregation where we feel like things are going on, and they are. These are good things, okay? So make sure that we make our goals actionable. Here's another suggestion. Make it risky. Risk drives results. If you always take the safe route, you're going to accomplish far less. In fact, secular studies have revealed a relationship between the goal difficulty and performance. One person says that those who set high goals where they stretch themselves accomplish far more than those with the easiest goals. And really, brothers and sisters, that's what we're talking about here when we talk about making it risky. We're talking about exercising our faith. We're talking about stretching ourselves. Think about this passage. We've referred to it quite a bit this month. Think about what Paul is teaching here. You have the power within you. The same power that raised Jesus from the dead, you have within you. And Paul says you can use that power to do far more than you ask or think. And so you have the capability within you. God has given it to you. God wants you to excel. He will help you excel. He will help you accomplish your goals. And that requires us to move by faith, to take risk. And when we do that, that is where we experience the power that Paul is talking about in this passage. Here's another suggestion on our goal-making process. We need to make them time-keyed. And what we're talking about here is a deadline. We might be talking about frequency or using a time trigger. Now, a few moments ago, I used this as a sample goal where somebody says, well, I want to study the Bible more. Again, not the most inspiring goal there ever was from this standpoint, because there's really it's just very vague, but it's admirable. All right, I think we should all want to study the Bible more, but how can I make this more real? How can I put some teeth in it, so to speak? Because what you see here is something that's missing a sense of urgency. When you look at that, I want to study the Bible more, that could happen over the span of 10 years. It could happen, the goal is there, it's just out there somewhere. I could make this goal and then put it off and stop thinking about it. But when I specify and say, and I put a time reference on it, well, I want to study on the topic of parenting during the month of March. Now I have put some deadlines on it. Now I've given something that demands my attention. It sparks me to move to action. Here's another example. Well, I want to invite 4 families into my home by December 31st. Now, be careful here, okay? Again, notable goal. I want to have people in my home. I want to practice hospitality. I want to put this to work. But this is February the 17th? December 31st is how far from now? It's a ways out. Let's just say that. 9 months, right? Guess what some of us might do? Well, it's February 17th, so I'm going to wait till December 1st to have 4 families in my home. Are you going to accomplish that goal? Probably not. So when we set tight deadlines, that is something that helps us to concentrate our effort. Tighter deadlines yield more productivity. And here's something else. When we set our goals, we need to make them exciting. We need to make them exciting. And brothers and sisters, what can get more exciting than our spiritual life and the thought of going home and being at God for eternity in heaven? Here's a passage in Colossians chapter 3. When we're setting our spiritual goals, we're constructing our spiritual life plan, we are putting passages like Colossians 3, 1 and 2 into practice. Paul says, if you've been raised with Christ, seek the things that are above, where Christ is seated at the right hand of God. Set your mind on things that are above and not on the things that are on the earth. Listen, I don't know about you, but I like thinking about the things above. I like thinking about an eternal world, living in the presence of God, being with Jesus and the Spirit, and being with the saints of all time. I can't wait to experience that. And so when I put my spiritual goals from that light, that I understand this is helping me get closer to that, then it becomes exciting. Think about this, what Paul says in Romans chapter 8 and verse 29. He has said that we will be conformed to the image of His Son. And what God is doing in us, we're willfully cooperating with day by day by day. And we trust that one day God is going to bring that to a completion. Think about it in this. Here is 2 Corinthians 3:18. And I don't use the NIV very much. But if you want to talk about exciting, I think the NIV captures it. Or he says, we with all who with unveiled faces contemplate the Lord's glory are being transformed into His image with ever increasing glory, which comes from the Lord, who is the Spirit. So day by day, your spiritual life is increasing more and more and more into the image of God, and that's exciting. Your spiritual goals help you accomplish these things. And finally, think of this passage, Philippians 3:14. This is one we looked at last week. This is out of the NIV as well, because I like the way the wording is here. Paul says, I have pressed toward the goal to win for the prize for which God has called me where? Heavenward. Heavenward. That's where we're all headed, brothers and sisters. And so that can be an exciting thing. And finally, when we set our goals, we need to make them relevant. Effective goals need to be relevant to your life and agree with the legitimate demands of your individual life. think about in this regard. Goals of the typical millennial undergrad student are going to differ from the working young family with small kids, whose goals are going to differ from the empty nester whose kids have already left the home and retirement is advancing. So for each of us, our goals are going to be unique to who we are. Set your goals relevant to your actual circumstances. They need to align with your spiritual values. They need to align with your other plans. So we've gone through this 7-step process. So now the question is very simple. How do I get started with this? Now, how do I do that? Now, if you have in your hand, and you may or may not, oh, that's last year's. Okay, I'll just put on the screen. Here is the self-examination sheet that we put together in this year's vision plan. It's on pages 6 and 7. How many of you have had an opportunity to fill this out at this point? Okay, most of you, good. Some of you may not have. So there is a purpose why we put this in this year's vision plan. This was designed to help you to craft a set of spiritual goals that are unique to your current level of spiritual maturity. And so if you haven't completed this yet, it only takes about 5 minutes. But if you have completed this yet, if you already have, I want to ask you this morning, what are the areas in which you need to improve? What are those areas? And so as you think about the areas here on this sheet of where you need to improve, what we're going to do is craft 7 to 10 goals that will be achievement goals to help you this year make progress in the areas where you're weakest. So we're going to go through some examples here for just a moment. And they're in your bulletin today is also an insert. I've given you some sample templates to use as you put these things together. So let's say there's an achievement I want to have spiritually this year. There's some things I want to work toward. I want to stretch myself, whatever it is. We talk about achievement goals. We're talking about goals that have a definable scope or a limited time frame. I want to accomplish X by a certain time, okay? And it might be a one-time accomplishment. But I just threw out an example here. This could be my goal, my achievement goal I want to get done in the next 6 months. I want to practice hospitality by inviting 6 people into my home by September 30th. All right, so I set that up as a goal, and I'm on my way. Now, let's talk about habit goals for a second, all right? And when we talk about habit goals, this is not talking about a one-time accomplishment. It's talking about an ongoing reality that becomes a new habit in my life where it just becomes second nature. And so, for an example, we might use it in this regard. A minute ago, we had a kind of an overall goal. I want to study the Bible more. Maybe you say, well, all right, I'm going to build this habit. I am going to study for 15 minutes every Thursday and a chapter in the book of Nehemiah at 6 o'clock in the morning beginning this Thursday, and I'm going to keep doing that for 13 weeks. Guess what I've just done? I've set you up to come to the Nehemiah class on every Thursday. But it's an easy example. An easy example of how to form a habit and get going with this. And guess what? When the class ends, or you finish up every week in Thursday reading Nehemiah, and you get to the next Thursday and Nehemiah's over, going, wow, I really missed that. What's another book I could study? And so you've built the habit. You've built the habit, and you go on from there. So think about each of the spiritual domains. If you look back again on page 6 and 7 of your vision plan, there are 7 spiritual domains. What are some of the goals that you might have? Achievement goals in each one of these areas. Well, maybe I could say, well, I want to read the wisdom books of the Old Testament by the end of June. That's maybe one achievement goal you could have. Maybe in the faith and acts, you could say, well, I am going to eliminate using filthy language by the end of the year. I'm going to work hard on that. And we'll get in a moment what some habit goals are to help you facilitate that. But maybe that's one. Or I'm going to fix a broken relationship with my brother by the end of the year. And I'm going to work on that and see how I can get that repaired. Maybe it's in the area of service where you say, I'm going to visit 10 of our widows or widowers by the 31st of December. Or I'm going to share the gospel with 3 people by the end of the year. Or I'm going to incorporate worship into my daily life. And typically while we're talking about that, we're talking about prayer. Putting prayer into our life day by day by day. And finally, in the area of stewardship, maybe I'm going to say, well, I'm going to practice hospitality by inviting 6 people into my home by the 30th of September. We already used that as an example earlier. So those are some high-end achievement goals that maybe we set as an example. All right. Habit goals are some of the things we can do to accomplish these tasks. For example, let's go back to the idea of knowledge. And I understand I want to read the wisdom books, and I'm going to do that every day. Maybe I do that through the daily Bible reading that comes out in the email. So I say I'm going to do that 5 days a week, every morning at 6:30. By the way, in your email, it's out every morning at 6 o'clock. You can get to that, and you can read through it. And you're going to start that tomorrow. And you're going to keep on going. That's a habit. Or if I'm talking about faith in action, I'm going to carry out what I set my achievement goal a while ago. Maybe I say, well, every time that I'm dealing with filthy language, I in the future am going to practice politeness every single time I'm tempted to respond emotionally to someone else. And that's how I'm going to beat this. I'm going to beat this problem with profanity once and for all. Or maybe it's with my relationships. I've got this person that is upset with me, and I'm going to try to work it out. I'm going to pray every day about this problem. In my morning prayer, I'm going to always exhibit a kind and humble spirit every time I see the person, and I'm always going to let them know the door's open. That's how I build a habit goal to fix relationships. Then I think about which areas of service. And I put mom up here just because she's mom. And she's a widow. So I'm going to go out and visit more widows. Well, I'm going to pick Donna Allen first by the end of next month. Or I'm going to be specific and invite 2 people every month in the area of evangelism to church. And guess what? If all of us did that, 146 members, all of us invited 2 people every month to church, there would be no more room. There would be no more parking. Which is a good problem to have, right? But we need to be thinking about our spiritual life in these ways. Or with worship. I'm going to pray every day for 15 minutes, beginning at 6 o'clock in the morning. I'm going to start that tomorrow, and I'm going to do it every day for 90 days. Guess what happens after 90 days? It's part of your daily routine. You get used to it, and it's part of who you are. And finally, in the idea of stewardship, and I just threw me in here. This is not a plea. If you want to have us over, fine. But invite Matt and Becky over for lunch before the 24th of March. We don't have anywhere to go today? No. But you get the point here, brothers and sisters, right? This is how you do this. And so, are you willing to stretch yourself? Listen, we've gotten too comfortable in the church. A lot of us are just coasting. And guess what happens? We start coasting. We start getting proud of ourselves. We get a little self-absorbed. We get content with what's going on and discontent with everybody else and everything else. But if we'll stretch ourselves to the point of discomfort, it will lead to growth. It will lead to progress. And so we need to yearn for more. We need to stretch ourselves to grow as God would have it. Listen, this is so important. I want to end today in the book of Hebrews. There's 3 passages. And I want you to see what the Hebrew writer urges New Testament Christians to do. He says, we desire each one of you, listen to this, to show the same earnestness, to have the full assurance of hope for how long? Until the end. Why? So that you may not be sluggish, but you may be imitators of those who through faith and patience inherit the promises. Brothers and sisters, we've got to stretch ourselves and push through all the way to the very end. Look at this passage. Here is the Hebrew writer saying in verse 22 of chapter 10, let us draw near with a true heart and full assurance of faith, with our hearts sprinkled clean from an evil conscience and from our bodies washed with pure water. Let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering. Why? Because he who promises faithful. Let us consider one another how to stir up one another to love and good works, not neglecting to meet together as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day approaching. You see, my spiritual life has got to become first and foremost in my life. And finally, chapter 12, verse 1, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which so clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured from sinners against hostility against himself, so that you may not grow weary or faint-hearted. Listen to that. See the place that our spiritual life is to be. It's to be at the first place, the front place, the most important priority. We can't coast our way to heaven. And the way that we're going to get there is building some goals where we can measure our progress and help others along the way to get there as well. That's why this is something that is so important. You know, Jesus thought it was so important that you be in heaven with him, that he willfully came here and submitted to the will of the Father so that you could be saved. He submitted himself to mistreatment. He submitted himself to the most awful type of treatment that you could imagine, all the way to the point of the most humiliating death a person could ever die. And that's the death on the cross. And he did that for you and for me. Because he has done that, because he has saved us, because he has made us new, because he has enabled us to have this inheritance, because he has promised heaven, we need to move forward seriously